This episode is brought in part to you by Real-Time CTMS, a leading provider of innovative software solutions for clinical trial research sites, site networks, sponsors, and CROs. To get a free demo, visit the company's website at realtime-ctms.com and complete one of their contact forms. Hello and welcome to the Note to File podcast, a collection of interviews, best practices, and candid commentary for clinical research sites. I'm your host, Brad Hightower. Today on the show, we have Mark Shapiro. Mark is the COO of xCures and principal investigator for XCELSIOR and BEAT19, two patient-powered, real-world data and outcomes registries in cancer and COVID-19, respectively. He's been focused on innovation and growth in clinical research for more than 20 years. Prior to joining xCures, Mark was SVP Operations for a global CRO, where he was responsible for a team of about 500 drug development professionals in 30 countries and a portfolio of more than 100 active clinical trials. In his role at xCures, he's been focused on developing and implementing AI and machine learning-enabled software systems for clinical research. In this episode, we discuss the strengths and weaknesses of decentralized clinical trials, the dilemma of patient referrals in clinical trials, and the challenges of scaling research site networks. Without further ado, Mark Shapiro. All right, Mark, thanks so much for coming on today.
Well, thank you for having me, Brad.
You're in sunny North Carolina today?
Sunny and beautiful today. Nice change. Spring is kind of in the air. You can tell by the pollen count starting to rise here.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of spring, minus that part. The allergies are no fun.
Yeah, it's been a cold winter. I'm definitely ready for some sunshine. Get outside a little bit.
Well, it seems like it's on its way, so that's a good thing. So I like to start every episode off essentially the same. I just like to hear a little bit about, how you got into clinical research. I know you've been in for quite some time now, so if you'd be so kind to share your backstory with us.
Sure. So it sounded like you called me old there, but I guess I've been in clinical research now for 22 years. It goes really fast, so I'll warn everybody that time flies. I was studying pharmacology in graduate school, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I didn't want to work in a lab, and I met a friend of a friend who was a CRA manager at a pharma company in Boston. And it was that time in the industry, probably kind of like now, when companies were desperate for CRAs. And so he said, "Are you interested in clinical research?" And I said, "Well, what is that?" And, in graduate school, I think we had in 4 years all of maybe 1 hour to talk about phase 1 to 3 clinical trials. And so I came in with a little bit of a bias that essentially we'd figured everything out. Like the pharmacologist had it all figured out by the time you got into a human trial. And, obviously that's not at all the case,
Right.
as I was quick to learn. Clinical trials are a lot more interesting, a lot more complicated. And so, I interviewed at his company. It was a CRO in Rockville, Maryland. And they said, "Great, do you want to be a CRA or a data manager?" And I said, "Well, tell me more about what a CRA does and what a data manager does." And, the thing that got me, and it's kind of a random choice that had a lot of effect on my career, was CRAs get to travel. That sounded great. I was definitely ready to, have a more interactive job after having spent all the prior 4 years in a lab. And, so I came into the industry. There really wasn't training. I mean, there's definitely more training available now. There wasn't, companies didn't have much training. And I learned on the job. They literally sent me out on my first day to co-monitor with a bunch of CRAs at a big site, well-known principal investigator even to this day. And, they told me what to do, and I sat there and did it, and they looked and I showed them what I did. It actually worked out really well. I learned a ton, but I think it was mostly luck that I was surrounded by really good contract CRAs who'd been doing a lot of work, and I was just willing to learn and do whatever they told me. And I loved the job, tried to learn and read as much as I could, and it kind of went on from there. So that's how I got into the industry. And, eventually I ended up at PPD, which I guess now is called Thermo Fisher, but, at the time was known for having a good training program. And by the time I got there, I had pretty much learned everything. So it was was a good experience. That was a great company. Probably still is, but I haven't worked there since I guess 2003.
And time flies, like you say. No, that's interesting to me that I think this is sort of a unique industry in some ways. Maybe not. I mean, I could be wrong, but I feel like there's so much nuance that you don't really learn until, like you said, you learn it on the job. You learn it as you go. I think there's a lot of, I speak from the site side primarily, but you can read and you can sit through a course or whatever the case may be, but it's not a job you can train for a week and you're on your own. For whatever reason, I feel like there's a pretty high learning curve when it comes to clinical trials. And like you point out, even in school, it's not well taught. It's not well understood to begin with, I think, unless you're in the industry, but people don't get much exposure to it until you're already sort of knee deep in it. You know what I mean?
When I was on the job and learning, study coordinators were mostly RNs, and it was kind of a side thing for them. In addition to everything else they did, every now and then a pharmacist. And, but there weren't training programs. It still is kind of this supplemental education. I think here in North Carolina, because we have a lot of CROs here, some of the community colleges, and actually I think at least one of the universities now has a clinical research track where they do offer more of these classes. And so, as I moved onwards in my career, I was always trying to encourage people to do those because I think it's helpful if you can to kickstart things. And, I spent some time, so I had kind of a long and varied career path as a CRA manager and then a study manager. And then I got this sort of idea that I would go back to business school. And so I went to business school and I became a management consultant where I spent most of the time helping pharma companies think about and implement new software, kind of to make clinical trials more efficient. And in that role, I ended up doing a lot of teaching. Like I would go into pharmaceutical companies and try to explain how pharmaceutical companies work. And it's also complicated that, people rarely understand how all the different silos come together. It is, I think, what we do in drug development, so complicated. There's so many PhD level people in each silo who really don't know much about what every other silo does, that the big picture is, it's hard to teach, it's hard to find, and there is a lot of tribal knowledge. So, I would teach these courses called Understanding Pharma, where we'd go through and talk about like all these little pieces and where the handoffs are in these companies. And I think it feels like we're sort of in the same situation today. I mean, the industry, I feel like basically the whole time I've been in the industry, people have been saying we have a shortage of qualified, trained personnel. And so it's only 22 years later, right?
Right. So let's bring those. I want to bring 2 points together. Then you talked about, the gaps in knowledge, and then sort of the rise in technology. Right now it's pretty clear you can't scroll through LinkedIn without reading about decentralized trials or all the new vendor technology that's sort of coming to the table. Do you feel like that gap is maybe starting to be bridged, or are we creating new problems, or sort of what role do you think that technology will continue to have in sort of starting to cinch up or knock down some of those silos?
It definitely has helped, but it also creates new problems. So when I started, and I often go back to this, I think a lot of people forget that we used to do clinical trials. The medical records were paper, and so were the case report forms, and so were the site files and the master file. Everything was just reams and binders of paper. But there was something useful about that because you could like sort of see the process as paper moved and people did things. The process is a little more invisible when it's happening inside computers, which sometimes makes it harder to understand kind of, where the handoff points are. So, my experience with EDC systems and CTMS and randomization, all these different software technologies, was that they were big improvements over the way we used to do things. Paper envelopes for randomization, right?
We still get some of those, so
still do, huh? Yeah, and yeah. So the challenge is now you have a bunch of technology that doesn't talk to each other, and you create new problems, right? That's I think what's happened. Even though it does make some things easier and more efficient, certainly communication. when I was at PPD, they didn't have their own email system. We used Netscape free email just to,
Nice.
but you think like, how could you do a clinical trial without email? And, all the letters were all mailed. Like you write and print and mail letters to your sites after a visit. So I think technology has helped, and it's also created new challenges. But ideally, right, the vision is that it should make clinical research and clinical care more seamless, like for the patients and the providers. And I think some of what's happened in the last 2 years has moved us in that direction. I, have increasingly interacted in these DCTs, decentralized trials. And, the idea of a patient being able to have a research visit in their home, it's really helpful. Like if you end up, especially with COVID precautions, having to go into a site, from the patient standpoint, you're giving up a lot more time. Certainly from the provider standpoint, like it's a lot of time and cost to doing it in that setting. So, telemedicine and some of these other things I think are helpful, but it definitely creates more and more layers of documentation through technology. And that's not easy.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think it's a particularly interesting time right now where we see so many people coming into the scene. I mean, I don't know if you sit in on those DTRA clubhouses. I mean, there's a bunch. Again, sitting at the site level, it can be a little overwhelming sometimes to see, all of these new platforms or solutions coming, knowing that we're going to have to interact with them some way or another. And it's not clear yet, maybe how that is, but we already deal with so much 6-7 systems to log into for any given study. So I think that's just again, it's a very interesting time, and I'm sort of cautiously optimistic from the site level as to how that's all going to play out. And again, it just doesn't seem clear quite yet.
Yeah, I mean, when EDC first came out, that was the thing. You had a bunch of different systems, and you had to be trained on every one because none of them were web-based, and they didn't really make a whole lot of sense. And so, the talk at the time was really that what we had done is take our data entry people in the CRO and just push that work onto the study coordinators as well. And so it was really just a cost shifting exercise. And I think most people who are on the receiving end of that would say that it only made things worse. And even today, we at xCures, my current company, interact a lot with academic medical centers who are trying to help them do more clinical research. And the study coordinators are the rate limiter, right? They can only take on, it's actually surprising. And I think at least in oncology where we are, the expectation is that a study coordinator can accommodate only a handful of patients per month. These are very intensive trials. There's lots of documentation. There's lots of technology. And, so I don't know that the technology has yet helped reduce the barrier to actually getting more people into clinical trials.
Yeah, and I think that's fair to say. Do you think, just as an aside, is there anything in your experience that's maybe unique to academic medical centers that make that the case as far as coordinator burden? I've worked across different site models, and for whatever reason, I feel like academia is really the least efficient, frankly, even though I feel like they oftentimes have the most resources to commit to it. I mean, you see, if you look at the leaderboards of a lot of the studies in their newsletters, it's almost never an academic institution. Or if it is, it's pretty weighted towards more private or independent organizations at the top. Do you think there's anything inherent about these academic centers that make that the case?
If I were speculating, and I have worked in those centers, a lot of it has to do with how they're organized. There's a real separation on the financial side between doing research and getting paid for research. And so, that doesn't create a scenario where there's like any reward for efficiency, right? It doesn't roll down anywhere.
There you go.
And at the same time, they are highly risk-averse, risk-managed organizations. A lot of the big ones self-insure, which means the risk management office has a great deal of influence, but it may be one of the only things that has influence. When I was at Duke, somebody in the dean's office at the medical school described it as a Byzantine or a feudal system, actually, where, the dean of the medical school could tell all these departments what not to do, but he couldn't tell them, and it was a he at the time, what to do, right? And, so it's a fertile environment for different things happening different ways across departments, across divisions. lots of bureaucracy because there's lots of people who have the power to say no to things, but not many people who can say yes. So, they tend to be slow and I think somewhat inefficient by design. And, at the same time, they have the resources and they are the engine that does so much clinical research.
That's true. That's why I wonder. I mean, look, academic medical centers aren't going anywhere. I mean, obviously, they'll still continue to make up a portion of these trials. Does that threaten the adoption of the DCT technologies, or do you feel like that will wane over time? Because again, my experience in academia was less than ideal. I'm happy that I don't have to go through all that bureaucracy anymore. Like you said, you hit it perfectly. There's the risk averse. If you're a coordinator at an academic medical center, you have very little incentive to out enroll the competition, or to, if anything, you're almost incentivized to do less work because you can get yourself in a lot less trouble by, if you don't put any patients in trials, and your monitor's not knocking on your door and your PI is not mad at you, and you're a little more safe. So, do you think that in any way inhibits DCT adoption?
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, that there can be this sort of perverse incentive against enrollment at academic medical centers. I think there are ones who are pretty motivated. Like, we do sometimes work with people who really have it figured out. And I don't know if that's just the team and the willpower to do the trials. But yeah, I think it's interesting that there may be disincentives in academic medical centers. And I think a lot of them is probably structural, but as you point out, there may be other factors at play. As it relates to academic medical centers and DCTs, I think it's going to be, the tug of war is financial, right? The academic medical centers have grown tremendously over the past several years, probably since, 2010 or so. And it's led to consolidation, where the academic medical centers have more concentration. And so there's basically more medical coverage in cities and less coverage the further out you go. It's something we think is a real problem with cancer care. In fact, in your state, we're actually talking to a number of people there about how we can try to deliver cutting edge cancer care more broadly, right? You have big geographic area, expertise concentrated in one or two places, and it's super inconvenient for patients, right? Getting access to care then becomes a problem. And so DCTs, I think, are a way to solve the patient access problem, but they create financial issues for those academic medical centers, right? If the care is done in the home by a third party, right, that's billing that's not happening. And I'm not sure how that gets resolved, right? It is a, follow the money situation. And so it is a structural disincentive, right, to this. But I think the flip side is, if you talk to practicing physicians in these academic medical centers, they would agree, you need to get the care to the patients. And so, they are, again, a little bit isolated from the financials of the academic medical centers, which are basically huge financial engines. Some of them honestly operate a little bit more like private equity firms. They've become so big and they're so invested in so many ways in different dimensions of the healthcare system. And, they're funding startups, right? They have venture capital wings, right? They've got equity positions in drugs that they're researching. There's a lot of complicated financial relationships now in healthcare.
Yeah, it is extremely nuanced, well beyond my scope of knowledge. But I took you down a winding path there, and interrupted your backstory. But I do want to hear about XCures, where you're at now. So tell me a little bit about XCures.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about XCures. So, we're a 3.5-year-old startup. Our founder was a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, individually wealthy guy, and an AI researcher at MIT and at Stanford before being diagnosed with cancer. And when he was diagnosed, he had metastatic melanoma. He then really just, reoriented his life around, instead of e-commerce, which is what he had been doing, around oncology. And he found a clinical trial. He had an exceptional response to an early cancer vaccine. So, 20 plus years later, he's still alive. I would say that's probably what you would consider a disease cure. Certainly melanoma was different at the time than it is today. It was probably the worst thing you could get. But, he had this idea, which has really driven what we're doing, that you want to help patients find and access the best options. And for cancer patients, at some point, that's going to be a clinical trial. So he set up his nonprofit, and then we were an offshoot of that as we tried to build software to kind of scale this idea. And the goal and what it's become is a way for cancer patients to go online and, they can sign up through our website and we will provide them with a personal health record. And what that does, talking about these information silos, is we've built technology to pull their medical records from all the different record systems, right? So in an academic center, right, you have a different system for the pharmacy, inpatient and outpatient, right? You have a different system for the cancer center and for the inpatient hospital. So we pull all this stuff into one record for the patient. And, again, since you called me old at the beginning, I was thinking about this idea of a baseball card. Like, how could you put all the information that the team, like the care team and the patient, really needed to know on a baseball card, right? Some graphs, some pictures, a couple of sentences, summary. And so that was one of the first things we tried to do, is pull this stuff together into a summary that the patient could access. They could share it with their doctor. We now have oncologists sign up just so that we can integrate the records that exist at their institution for them. It's a kind of time-saving exercise. And then we could use that data to help them figure out, like, are they eligible for a clinical trial? What I will tell you is that if the trial's not open where you are, there's a strong disincentive for physicians to refer patients out. It's basically like you should never speak of it, right? That there might be an option outside of this institution. And, so where we've really tried to focus is, how do you bring that to the stuff to the patient? And so we started doing and supporting expanded access programs, which, if you're not familiar, are conducted under 21 CFR 312, like a clinical trial, but they're for treatment. It's a treatment protocol. And I think this is where we're hoping, we align the incentives, right? That the patient stays with their doctor, the doctor gets access to a therapy. And by pulling the data together, we're able to send the sponsor high quality data. Those things were sort of notorious for being, low quality data. And obviously the FDA didn't want to go in and, do a bunch of auditing and 483s when a doctor is doing their best to treat a terminally ill patient. So it's been a zone where that led to the reputation of low quality data in these things. And what we've tried to prove is that you can have high quality data and sort of, it's a win-win-win. So that's what we've been focusing on. And I think as it relates to sort of healthcare delivery in rural states, this is how you try to bring these things, because sponsors won't open clinical trials at small sites. The CRO budgeting process is like, you have a budget for 10 sites. So you go to the 10 biggest sites. And, what we really want to think about and encourage people to think about DCTs and expanded access programs and all of these is, ways to bring these things out to other patients who are not at, these main, like whether it's an academic medical center or basically a big research institution, is really broadening access to care. And I think that has a lot of positive implications for patients. I know from my previous role at an oncology CRO, we bought 6 CROs worldwide in 7 years, just looking for more patients, right, to feed our oncology clinical trials, doing trials in 30 plus countries. And yet when I talk to all these people here in the US, there's lots of cancer patients in the US who are not in clinical trials, who would definitely want to be in if it was an option for them, right? So how can we do this closer to home? So that's really the vision of xCures. We've worked with about 2,000 patients so far, and we've seen some early success. We've got a couple of compassionate use programs that have had some really positive responses, and some of that data is going to the FDA, which we're excited about. Really to prove that companies can get something of benefit out of this. They can help the patients and see something in return, which should encourage them to do more of it. So yeah, I'll stop there and let you ask questions if you want.
Yeah, I've got a few questions. So I'm trying to just walk my brain through process here. So first of all, I love the idea of having, again, as somebody who works at a site, operates sites, having a easy to access, maybe not all encompassing, but much more encompassing than I'm going to get otherwise, medical record for a patient, because that's, we're still using fax machines in the year 2022, right? And as you alluded to earlier, even one institution is siloed into different sections to where if I request records from one office, they may say there's no records here when really they were an inpatient. So it's on a different system. So that's a huge problem because we want to put patients in trials. We want to offer them the ability to participate. But if we can't do our due diligence to qualify them, then it's pointless. So that alone is already pretty exciting to me. But then as far as, let's say you identify some, or you work with some rural patients who are qualified for a trial elsewhere, what happens then? I mean, are you able to approach the sponsor and try to incorporate some sort of decentralized methodologies, or are you basically say, look, you got to go here to do it? I mean, do you guys have any role in sort of liaisoning that process?
Yeah, I think we're trying to figure out how to do more of it. So, we've done some decentralized trials in oncology, which is a hard thing to think about, where there's sort of a dual role where you're maybe layering standard of care, wherever the patient's receiving it, and you're trying to layer in with some coordination from the site, like additional assessments through telemedicine and, home phlebotomy or home nursing. So, we are trying to do this for more patients. We've promoted the idea that, if you can, in those types of settings, have the patient receive the care under their home physician, stay at home, and have some bridge between their home physician and the PI, like kind of a hub and spoke model to encourage this. Because again, the financial barrier exists on many levels, at the patient level, at the site level. So you really want people to just be able to get whatever they need wherever they are. We have helped patients with travel, working with nonprofit partners at times, but it's not scalable, right? And, I would call out, like, there's some good companies over the years that have made freely available, like Airbnb has done stuff for patients where they, like, if you're going for cancer care, they provide you with free Airbnb. I mean, so there's companies that have tried to help, but none of those solutions are really scalable, right? And it involves basically a lot of people giving a lot of things away for free. So, getting stuff deployed to where the patient is, their doctor, giving their doctor access to, an investigator where community physicians, you want to bridge the gap. And I think telemedicine is a type of thing where you can do that. You can bring together discussions. So my hope is that is kind of the future, that patients are able to get more of this stuff wherever they are. And that ultimately it's, that there is a business to be made for the people who can connect these pieces. That's our whole philosophy, right?
Sure. Well, that's what you brought up, something I find interesting, and I've seen talked about more and more, is the concept of being able to stay with your treating physician and still participate in a trial, sort of as a hub and spoke type model. I find that really interesting, and honestly, it seems like an easy solution to a lot of issues we have, with clinical trial participation. Do you think, as it stands anyways, does the regulatory landscape make that easy to do, or do you think that it's prohibitive? And this is where I kind of struggle sometimes, because as a site, I'm thinking 1572s, GCP training, calibrated equipment, and all these things that need to happen everywhere that we sort of get beaten into our heads. I mean, is that
delegation of responsibilities and SOPs? Yeah,
right?
It's hard. I mean, it's, we've put a lot. I had, both in academia and outside of academia, done work supporting investigator-initiated studies under INDs. And so we've tried to bring this kind of like portable approach. And I think there's companies out there trying to do this, where you sort of, you practice and we will just kind of drop in the infrastructure and study coordinators as needed, right? And I think that, that's an important component to this type of decentralized model. It creates a lot of paperwork headaches, right? And this many-to-many relationships that are very hard to track in electronic systems. We're discussing this yesterday, that, people have more than one doctor, right? Especially in these complicated conditions, right? They have many doctors. And so, can you have a doctor who's primarily doing research and being sort of the air traffic controller for all these things for these patients? And to what extent do each one of those other physicians need to be involved in the trial, or simply need to be aware of it? And I think largely they need to be aware of it, but they don't necessarily need to be on the 1572 if they're doing standard of care. But how do you get the records from them to make sure you have a complete picture? I mean, our system is still very fragmented.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's what I do. We try to integrate within clinics that don't have research infrastructure, and we do it for free, and we split study income. But what I find is that, a lot of the places where this needs to happen are maybe rural areas, or again, away from the existing large academic medical centers or hospitals, whatever the case may be. But the problem you run into is that you've got a smattering of patients over here, a smattering over here. No one site is financially viable as a site, but if you can really sort of bring everybody together, but you alluded to nobody wants to refer a patient away. We love to believe in altruism, and it does exist, but they still don't want to send their patient away for, number of different reasons. So it does makes a lot of sense to be able to sort of combine those models in a way. But again, I like to think that I'm a forward-thinking site, person, but even I get hung up in like, whoa, we can't do that because they're not on the 1572. They don't have GCP training, and how are we going to overcome that? And I think that's just an interesting, conundrum in a way. Maybe it's not. Maybe, like in so much we do, I think we tend to overdo things to a large degree when it comes to some of those guidances that are out there.
Yeah, it's not just our regulations too that make this sometimes challenging. It's, there's areas like we did a lot of nephrology research. One of the companies I was at where, when you have patients on dialysis, there's only 2 big dialysis companies in the world. And so they do research, but they use this kind of, the study coordinators are basically like traveling CRAs, right? And so whichever centers have patients, they're an employee of the sort of parent corporation, and they travel around and do the research, and the dialysis clinics do their thing. But it's hard to do that, under like various medical accreditation, unless that person is an employee or they've been through some process where you've, qualified them, background checked them, all these things that, are not necessarily clinical research barriers, but they're barriers to bringing in a person as a study coordinator who's not part of the site itself.
Right.
So, not insurmountable, but complicated for sure. And I think that idea of like, if you really have visibility into where are patients that might be eligible for the trial, and can you sort of swoop in to the site and help them out without taking their patient away, that's really what we want to be able to do. Sounds like that's what you're working on right now with some of these sites.
Well, that's what I think it's, or my hope anyway, is that it's sort of a 2-prong approach, right? You've got the tech coming with sort of the DCT space, and then I still think you're going to need these sort of integrated research organizations, whatever you want to call them, to sort of help be boots on the ground for some of this. Because again, I think the curve is difficult to without somebody there to sort of hold hands. And frankly, that's what a lot of research coordination is it's holding the hand of the physician and really walking them through what it means to participate in clinical trials. Because it's just not well understood. I talk to physicians all the time, and they think they know what it involves, but they just don't. It's no fault of their own. We sort of hold this, arcane knowledge that not everybody gets to know about until you're sort of knee deep in it, and then it's too late by then.
Right. It's hard to ever develop that level of competency unless you have enough scale, right? That, if you're a physician who only does one research patient a year, it's unlikely that you're going to remember all the elements of informed consent, right? And, you need to do things at enough scale to make it repeatable and efficient and produce quality. But that's very hard in this model where you're trying to deliver research as part of care anywhere and everywhere. But until we do that, it's really hard to have an inclusive system. And I think the contrast with some of the projects we would do in, on the CRO side, like one of the things we like about countries that have sort of legacy, socialized medicine is there's countries where basically if you had cancer, everybody went to one hospital in the whole country, right? It's very inconvenient for the patients, but it's very efficient from a delivery standpoint.
Sure.
And it's efficient from a research standpoint, but that's not the system that we have. And I don't think it's necessarily the system that we want or that patients want either. Like this giant centralized systems, tend to lack a personal touch too, right? Of what people want from their healthcare providers.
Well, and I think that I see that on the research side too. I think it requires such a level of personalization. It's difficult to scale because everybody's so different in, how they want to approach, whether it be patient or physician that we work with. I mean, working within different clinics, they all do things differently. They all have a different level of comfort in what a research team does or doesn't do. And then obviously, patients have preferences as far as, how they want to interact. So that can make scale challenging, I think, because you've got to account for such a broad spectrum of options. I think that's really interesting to me, like how to scale that effectively. And that's not necessarily clear to me at this point.
Yeah. I don't think it's clear to any of us. I have high hopes for, mobile devices, right? That patients and physicians will, hopefully all have smartphones that could all be video enabled, that you really could reduce the barriers to doing some of this stuff. And COVID, I think, has pushed us all, out of our comfort zone on all this stuff in a way that, it's not going to go back to the way it was before. May not all be DCTs, but it's, now that these technologies exist and people have seen the benefits, we're gonna use them more. It's just a question of getting through all of these hoops, to make that happen and to do so in a way that all the stakeholders feel included.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, that's something I'm cautiously optimistic about because, again, we see a lot of aside conversations, I guess, and it's not always. I don't think it's always inclusive of all the interested parties. So I think we're seeing that be addressed more in general. So again, that the whole thing leaves me cautiously optimistic that we'll continue to get better. If I can shift gears a little bit, something Sure. I like to ask everyone who comes on is, what would you share with the audience in terms of maybe some tools or resources you use that something that just makes you better at what you do, whether it it doesn't have to be clinical research related, books, podcasts, whatever the case may be, software. Maybe share something with us that is indispensable to you.
Sure. That my mind immediately went to, and I think the thing that it's going to sound a little silly, I think, but I've always found it useful to go back to the FDA guidance documents. And so whenever I have a question, there are guidance documents on all sorts of obscure topics that are almost always very well thought out, very well considered products of multiple stakeholders. And it's not always easy necessarily to find the right one. But as a CRA just starting out, it was like, here's ICH whatever, and it's pretty clear whether or not you were following it, right? And so if you can point to a guidance document, and I just think is a generally good practice in clinical research, that should be your first, it's either your own SOPs or go look it up in a guidance document and see if you can kind of expand your horizon of understanding a little bit. And I really, I think everybody should be open to kind of like, that should be not your first, maybe your second or third stop for information. Again, it's not easy, but it is pretty definitive. I feel like, even doing this 22 years, like I am always going back and checking things in guidance documents. Sometimes I'll find something that's actually useful in a footnote or something. As you try to understand how the FDA is going to approach what you're doing, between the guidance documents and at least CDER makes their standard operating procedures public. Other divisions are not as transparent about their SOPs. But if you read those, you say, okay, how's the FDA going to approach this? Well, they're going to pull out this checklist and they're going to go through, and this is what they're going to check, and this is what they're looking for. And so we should all be aware of how we're going to be evaluated, right? And so I think just having the willingness to go to those things, it makes us better at our job. It helps us when we're in doubt. Now, I will say what we don't have that I really like about the British system is we've had questions and just there's a phone number and you can call the MHRA and ask a question. And I think that's pretty great.
Right. I know that FDA used to publish emails that were questions specifically about clinical research topics. I don't know if that's still a thing, but I feel like I had seen that before previously.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, all the CROs I worked at, it was like forbidden for people to try and talk to the FDA directly.
Yeah, you don't want to open up a can of worms.
Right, and for good reason, perhaps. But the idea that when you get into these tricky situations, right, where it isn't black and white in the guidance, and you want to discuss it, I think the name of this podcast, right, memo to file, like this is what we train people to do: is you sort of you document what happened. You try and I encourage people to mention the guidance that you looked at, right? Is this ICH E6, 5.1.2, like what are you thinking about when you're trying to understand the situation? And at least it puts it all down. Like there's a record that you did your diligence in this process of trying to address it. And sometimes that's the best you can do. Some of these situations don't have clear-cut answers. I mean, most of the time they do, but not always. I will say that IRB guidances and across the board things have become more clear than they were. 20 years ago, if you knew to do it, it was useful to go look at like 483s and stuff online, or the Freedom of Information Act reading room, where you could search for hours to try and find a relevant scenario that was similar. But, those are useful things, especially depending on which side you're on. If you just want to say like, look, here's a similar case where somebody got a 483 for doing this. Let's stop doing it. Let's come up with a new way to do it.
Right. Yeah, I'm as petty as it sounds, I've managed to win arguments with CRAs by, going back to FDA guidance. And, I don't want to say arguments, but at a site, we've all been there where you're being asked to do something that you're like, okay, I don't necessarily agree with that. So I've done the same thing. I've gone and checked out FDA guidance and been able to say, hey, look here, you got a leg to stand on. And like you say, I think a lot of it comes down to showing your work, right? Showing that you went through that due diligence to make whatever decision that you made. So no, I love that advice, and that took me longer than it should have to consider doing.
Yeah, it's I think if you think back about somebody who's reconstructing the trial long after the fact, right? CRAs move on, study coordinators move on, and so all that's left is what was written down by the two of you in your discussion. Trying to use your evidence, and at least then whoever's looking at it knows that there's a thorough process, right? And, what the thinking was at the time, and trying to understand the situation. And, I think some people might consider there being risk of like explaining yourself too much. But, in retrospect, if you think that the people are doing their jobs effectively, they've done their diligence, they've looked for similar situations, they've considered it, they've written it all down. And, that's essentially the best thing you can do. Otherwise, like that's the record you leave. And, I've had experiences where trials that I was monitoring many years later were audited. And I, through the grapevine, got feedback that something in my report was helpful, right?
Sure.
I had said that, per this plan, we were supposed to do this, and I did it. And somebody, said that they didn't, but it was in there. And so they said, okay, so we know it was, people were instructed to do it a certain way.
Yeah. And that's a great tenet to carry around. I tell my coordinators, if someone walks in, they want to look at a binder, but they can't talk to you, can they look at it and figure out what happened? Is it clear enough that, they can follow the narrative, or they can follow the line of thinking? And I think that's not a bad way to think about the work that we do, again, especially at the site level where there's just so much madness at times.
Yeah. And I think documentation is really key when you have personnel turnover. And there's just, if you think about the industry state today, right? Turnover is wild right now. And so how do you have that continuity? I think, drive study coordinators crazy. They get a new CRA every time who wants it done differently, right? I mean,
you're preaching to the choir.
Well, it's just, it's been this way for as long as I can remember.
Sure.
And, these emails and memos and all the stuff that you're putting in there is left for posterity for exactly what you said, which is to hope that somebody can understand what was going on when they look at this 5 years from now and nobody who was involved is still there.
Yep. No, I love it. Mark, where can people find you online?
So they can find me at xCures. Our website is www.xcures.com. I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn, Mark Shapiro at xCures. Those are probably my two big ones. I'm not on Twitter or things like that, but and I'm I've been in the industry a long time. Always look forward to these kinds of conversations. So, if anybody wants to reach out, either to me at xCures or on LinkedIn, any of your listeners, and certainly you, Brad, please do.
Very good.
Great to meet people in the industry. And it is, in 20 years, it is a small business. Like you can cross the country and walk into a site and be like, hey, didn't we work together 10 years ago or whatever? Like it is a, remarkably small business. And so in a few years, like between conferences and all this stuff, like you'll know people and they'll know you, and all these, hopefully we get back to all these conferences too. I think, it's nice to know that there's other people who are going through the same thing you are. And it's a good forum for that. So.
No, I could not agree more. I'll drop your contact info on our show notes on the website. And I really want to thank you for coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was very nice to meet you. Thanks for having me, Brad.
Thanks, Mark. As always, thank you so much for listening to Note to File Podcast. Make sure and check us out at notetofilepodcast.com for episode transcripts, show notes, and guest contact information. Thanks again.